If you have an anterior pelvic tilt, then it's really important to understand how you can modify your yoga practice so that it can support you as you try to correct this problem, rather than making the problem worse. So that's exactly what I'm going to teach you how to do in this video. Obviously, I'm an Ashtanga Yoga practitioner, so I'll be talking about it in the context of Ashtanga, but you can apply these principles to any form of yoga that you practice. Firstly, what is an anterior pelvic tilt and how do you know if you have one? Well, the pelvis is this bony structure here that connects the torso or the trunk to the legs. And in a normal, healthy individual, the pelvis is in what we'd call a neutral position. So that means the bony points on the front of the pelvis, which are known as your ASIS, they would line up with the bony points on the back of your pelvis, which are known as the PSIS, the anterior or the posterior superior iliac spine. So anterior is the front and posterior is the back. And the pelvis moves into an anterior and a posterior tilt all the time to facilitate all kinds of different movements like standing up and sitting down, walking, running, crouching, you name it. If it involves moving the trunk relative to the legs, then the pelvis will be involved and it will be moving to facilitate that movement. So it's normal and it's healthy to be able to tilt your pelvis. But what can happen is due to an imbalance of the muscles around the pelvis, we can actually get stuck in an anterior tilt. So that means that the front of the pelvis drops forwards, and what you end up with is a pelvis that looks like this. I'm exaggerating obviously so that you can see, but your lower back will become really arched, more arched than usual. We all have a little bit of an arch here, but if you have an anterior pelvic tilt, you'll notice that it becomes much more pronounced. So it's almost like you're sticking out your bottom all the time. And also you'll notice that your belly will stick out. So even if you have quite a low body fat, your belly will stick out due to that position, that curve in the back. And you can imagine how painful this might be. If you're in this position all the time, it's compressing the joints of your spine. So it begins to cause problems with back pain, hip pain, and then because the whole body is connected, it can cause problems in all different types of areas of the body. But the good news is it's the muscles that decide the position of your pelvis. So in most people, you can actually correct this problem of an anterior pelvic tilt by working intelligently with the muscles. So how do you know if you have an anterior pelvic tilt? Well, the first thing you should do is have a look at your pelvis from the side. You could get somebody to have a look and take a photo for you, or you could just look in a mirror. And if you just stand with kind of a neutral position, just how you would stand naturally, and then have a look at the position of your pelvis. If it was like mine, where the belly was sticking out and the lower back was really arched like this, then you might have an anterior pelvic tilt. It's almost always comes with some sort of back pain or some sort of pain around the pelvis area because it's putting pressure in the wrong places. Another thing you can do is you can put little stickers on your ASIS, on those two bony points at the front of the pelvis. And you do the same, put two stickers on those little bones that stick out at the back of the pelvis here. And then you have a look at the two stickers, at the four stickers, the two sets of stickers. And if the front ones are lower and the back ones are higher, quite a lot higher, then you might also have a pelvic tilt. But if you're not sure, then you should just see a physiotherapist or a corrective exercise specialist, and they'll be able to have a look for you and tell you if there is a significant tilt there. What causes an anterior pelvic tilt? It's an imbalance of the muscles between the front and the back of the body. So remember that muscles work in pairs, and in anterior pelvic tilting, there are two pairs of muscles that you should be most interested in. The first is the lower back muscles, or the back extensors, and the abdominal muscles. So muscles work in pairs. They're a pair of muscles that work, so when one of them contracts, the opposite muscle will relax. If you have an anterior pelvic tilt, your lower back muscles are contracting so much all the time, they're really strong, they're really active, that it actually causes your belly muscles, your abdominal muscles, to switch off, and they become weak and underused. And this is what causes that position of the sticking out belly and the arch, the over pronounced arch in the lower back. The second set of muscles is the hip flexors and the glutes. So those two are opposites, or antagonist and agonist relationship. So when you have an anterior pelvic tilt, you almost certainly have really, really tight, strong and overactive hip flexor muscles. Almost everyone does, but in somebody whose pelvis is tilted, that's even more of an imbalance than the average individual. So strong, tight, active hip flexors and weak antagonists, so weak glute muscles. It's almost like they're competing, and if these muscles are always switched on, it never gives the glutes a chance to work. So the hip flexors are pulling the front of the pelvis down and contributing more to the tilt, and the glutes are switching off, so they're not doing the opposite. They're never pulling the pelvis down at the back. So to summarize, if you have an anterior pelvic tilt, you have really, really strong and tight hip flexors and back muscles. And you have really weak and underactive abdominals and glutes. How do you correct an anterior pelvic tilt? The answer is you have to stretch the muscles that are tight, and you have to strengthen the muscles that are weak. So for your anterior pelvic tilting, that means you have to strengthen the glutes, strengthen the abs, whereas you have to stretch the hip flexors and stretch the back extensor muscles. If you do have symptoms of back pain or hip pain and you suspect that you have an anterior pelvic tilt, then I would definitely go and see a physical therapist. Get them to have a look at the position of your pelvis, and if they think that there might be something there, then they might give you a program of exercises and stretches that you would do a few times throughout the day to try and correct and neutralize that position of the pelvis. But just to give you a flavor of what might be involved in that, when I was given my program, I had things like hip flexor stretches like this that I would be doing throughout the day as often as possible, taking breaks every hour from sitting to make sure that I was doing these stretches and making sure not to extend my back, which is kind of a compensation, but really keeping the pelvis tucked under so that I can get into the stretch of the hip flexors. I was doing all kinds of glute strengthening exercises like bridges and clams and using a band around the legs to strengthen the glutes. I was also doing a lot of abdominal strengthening exercises as well as gentle stretches for the back muscles. So definitely get in touch with a therapist that can help watch you do those exercises and check your form and make sure that you're performing them correctly. But what I really wanted to talk to you about today is how you can use your Ashtanga yoga practice to help correct this position of the pelvis rather than making things worse. And there are two main movement patterns that I think we should be most aware of, and those are forward bending and backward bending. So if you have an anterior pelvic tilt, you already have really strong, really tight back extensor muscles. So which kind of group of postures do you think that you should avoid, or that you do think that you should be taking it easy with whilst you're correcting this position? The answer is back bending. So when you back bend, the back extensor muscles have to shorten and tighten so that you can extend your spine. So let's have a look at a posture like Shalabhasana. It's easy to imagine what's happening in this pose. So in order to lift my chest and my legs up, these muscles here need to shorten. And so every time you do a back bend, Shalabhasana, Cobra, upward facing dog, Urdhva Dhanurasana, every time you do a back bend, you are shortening those already tight, shortened muscles. So doing back bends with an anterior pelvic tilt, sadly, is not advisable. So what would I advise you to do instead? I would say skip out all of the back bends in the sequence that you're doing for now. So I don't mean swap upward dog for Cobra. I don't mean skip Urdhva Dhanurasana and do bridge pose instead. I mean don't do any back bends, because every time you back bend, you need to be doing an abdominal exercise to balance it out. Otherwise, you're just going to continue to increase the gap between, or increase the imbalance between the abs and the lower back muscles. So skip the back bends for now. What would you do in a vinyasa? Skip upward dog, go from your chaturanga, straight back into downward dog. I know it seems a bit crazy. When you're used to doing these movements so many times a day, it can almost feel a little bit intimidating to let them go. But if you want to see an improvement in your back pain or hip pain, whatever it is that you have, you need to be willing to modify your practice to support that. In your vinyasa, go straight back into downward dog. Don't do upward facing dog. In Urdhva Dhanurasana, instead of doing bridge pose or the full version of wheel pose, do a bridge. So not bridge pose, but an actual bridge. The difference is, bridge pose is a back bend. A bridge is when you flatten your lower back to the mat, so you're engaging your abs, which is great for anterior pelvic tilts. You engage your glutes, also great, and then you extend your hips by using your glutes. You don't send your hips up into a back bend. You stay where the pelvis, where the spine is neutral, and you just focus on squeezing your glutes and crunching, almost like you're connecting your hip bones up towards your lower ribs. Hold it for 5 and then repeat 3 times as if you were doing the usual posture, Urdhva Dhanurasana. If you practice with a teacher, then I would just let them know how and why you're modifying your sequence, and I'm sure that they will be happy to support you in any way that they can. So what happens if you're practicing second series or the intermediate series, because there's quite a big chunk of back bending in that sequence, which again, I'm not demonizing back bending. I think back bending is amazing and fun and very therapeutic if you have a neutral pelvis. But if you have this problem of anterior tilting, you need to correct that first before you go back into back bending. So if I were you, I would take that chunk of back bending postures out for now. You could do the leg behind the head postures, no problem, because that involves a lot of rounding the back and engaging the abs. But you need to be intelligent and intentional about which postures you're practicing whilst you're trying to correct this pelvic tilt. So we've talked about back bending. What about forward bending? So in the primary series, you have loads of opportunities to fold forwards, which you might think would be really therapeutic for somebody with an anterior pelvic tilt, because in a forward bend, not only are you stretching the hamstrings, you're stretching the whole of the back of the body, right? Because it's all connected. But what can happen is, in yoga, we have this idea of the most beautiful forward bend being with a really flat back. And it's almost like we're going into a back bend by extending the spine as we come into a forward bend. And this is fine for most people. But if you have an anterior tilt, this is going to make your problem worse, because when you're extending your spine like this and folding forwards like this with a flat back, you're actually engaging your back muscles. If you're engaging your back muscles, you're definitely not engaging your abs. So the disparity between the two is becoming bigger and bigger over time. So when you forward bend, you need to think, forget about the perfect yoga pose of a flat back and your chest on your thighs. You need to think about rounding your back. It's not going to be pretty, but you need to use your abs to fold forwards. When you're engaging your abs, your back muscles can relax, and you can get the benefit and the therapeutic stretching of the back muscles. So you can round your back, engage your abs, and fold like this. In other parts of primary series and also in vinyasas, sun salutations, there are a lot of vinyasas where you inhale to lengthen your spine. So let's say you're, for example, coming out of Paschimottanasana. There's an inhale, lengthen the spine and look up. And here, that is essentially extending the back. So that means you're using your back muscles. So for that vinyasa, in all of the poses, I would say just forget about it. So you could lift your head, but stay connected to your abs and just forget about getting the flat back, and just think of staying connected to the abs, letting the back relax. It would be the same in a standing pose. Let's say, for example, Prasarita Padottanasana. Say you were folding forwards and you were doing it with a slightly rounded lower back. You're engaging your abs. And then there's an inhale, head up, lengthen the spine. So instead of sticking out your tailbone and creating this flat back, you would need to think instead about keeping your abs engaged and just lifting up. So the difference from the side would be something like this. Let's say originally you were doing this. Inhale, head up. Exhale there. Whereas now what you want to be thinking about doing is rounding the lower back, engaging your abs. Inhale, lift the chest, stay rounded. Exhale there. Inhale back up. So hopefully you could see the difference. It's quite subtle, but all that you're going to do if you keep trying to flatten out your back and stick out your bum is you're going to make the problem worse, of the anterior pelvic tilt worse. So we've talked about back bending, aka don't do it. We've talked about forward bending, which we're going to try and work on using the abs to fold forwards rather than folding with a flat back. Now let's think about some other ways that you could use your yoga practice to assist in correcting this tilt. So we said that in somebody with an anterior pelvic tilt, the glutes are usually quite weak. So what I like to do in my yoga practice is to try and stay connected to my glutes, especially when I'm doing the standing postures or when I'm folding forwards and coming in and out of forward bends. How do you do that? You would basically just try to keep them engaged. So you just think about them, you can even tap them if you like as you're folding forwards. Try to keep the glutes switched on, almost as if they're resisting you from going down into a forward bend. When you come back out of a posture, same again, you squeeze the glutes and just push the floor away and feel like the legs are working really strongly to pull you out of the pose. Most of the standing postures, there's an opportunity to connect to the glutes. It's just that there's so much else going on that it's usually not our priority. But if you make it an intention to use your glutes in all of the standing postures, even in the seated postures, when you're sitting, you're going into Paschimottanasana, squeeze your bum on the way down. You could keep it squeezed. It all kind of ties into the same movement of trying to do the opposite. So you're trying to posteriorly tilt your pelvis. That means you want to engage your abs, tuck your pelvis under by squeezing the glutes. And it doesn't look so pretty, but it's going to help a lot in the long term. So that would be my other piece of advice, is avoid back bending. Forward bend by rounding the back and using your abs, and then connect to the glutes. Use them in all the postures that you can. Feel them, connect to them, touch them, tap them, fire them up, and they're going to become more and more active over time. The fourth element that I would look at in your practice is how much of a stretch you can get in your hip flexors. We don't have so much of an opportunity to really stretch those muscles, not in the primary series anyway, and in the second series it comes mostly in the form of a back bend, which we're kind of trying to avoid. So the main one for me in Ashtanga Yoga would be Virabhadrasana A. So make it your priority to, in this posture, stretch the hip flexors of the back leg. So that would mean tucking the tailbone. Don't arch your back because then you lose the stretch. Tuck your tailbone, send your hips forwards and down towards the front of your mat. And then outside of your practice, you would need to be doing hip flexor stretches as much as possible, because hip flexors are tight in everyone. So we sit using our hip flexors, we walk using our hip flexors. They're tight in everyone. So if you have severely tightened hip flexors, you're going to need to work hard to try and stretch them out. So I would be doing these, the ones that I showed you from my program, every hour, on the hour, if you can. And remember, keep the lower back neutral, so it's not arching. Otherwise, you lose the hip flexor stretch. You need to keep the pelvis tucked under. You need to tuck the tailbone in order to keep the stretch there. So let me just summarize one last time what you need to do in your Ashtanga Yoga practice if you have an anterior pelvic tilt. Number one, try to avoid back bends for now. I know it's tempting and it's sad to give up some of your favorite postures, but if you want to be pain-free and you don't want to do yourself damage long term, then you need to spend some time now correcting the tilt, otherwise you're going to make the problem worse. Number 2, forward bends with a rounded spine and active abs. So it's not going to look pretty, but it's going to help to release off those really tight muscles along your spine, and it's also going to get the abs fired up. Number 3 is to connect to your glutes as much as you can in your practice. And number 4 is wherever you can in the practice, you try to get hip flexor stretch, although as I said, I don't believe that there's enough of an opportunity there to stretch them. So do your hip flexor stretches outside of practice. So that's within the context of your practice mostly, but then outside of your practice, you probably need to be doing some glute strengthening, some ab work. So strengthen your glutes and your abs and stretch your back muscles and your hip flexor muscles as often as you can, probably several times throughout the day, doing one of each of those things. So if you think you have an anterior pelvic tilt, let me know in the comments below, and let me know if you would like to see some more of the exercises that I do to correct it. I'm also thinking about sharing a yoga flow which incorporates those modifications. So a yoga flow that wouldn't have any back bends and would be folding forwards with the cues of rounding the back. So that you can just kind of follow along and you can get the flow of what I was saying. So let me know in the comments if that's something that you would be interested in. If you have any questions at all, you know what to do, leave them in the comment box below. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, because then you will get notified next time I post a new video. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you found some useful tips on pelvic tilts. If you'd like to know about the opposite problem, about posterior pelvic tilts, then you'll have to leave me a comment below saying posterior pelvic tilt, and then I'm going to make a video exactly like this one that talks you through the changes that you would need to make in your practice if you have a pelvis that's tucked under. So thanks again, see you soon.